What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Let's Talk MMA podcast. Hope you guys are having an amazing one. And this episode is sponsored by DAZN, a global home for boxing fights with over 150 fights per year from the best fighters in the sport of boxing, and sometimes even crossover fights with MMA fighters going into boxing, such as this weekend we have Nate Diaz versus Jorge Masvidal. And as we know, they fought in MMA before. They're going to be switching it up this time in the boxing world on July 6th, live on DAZN. Their first fight was massive. It was really fun, exciting, and this boxing match should also be an extremely interesting fight as well. Jorge's always had the power. He's always had the speed advantage against Nate, but Nate Diaz has the cardio, the chin, and the experience of sparring with some of the best boxers in the world. And back when they fought the first time, Jorge's using a lot of kicks and elbows on Nate Diaz, but this is boxing this time. It's going to be more in Nate Diaz's world, which could make it a real competitive fight, man. Before they fought for almost 15 minutes, right? Nearly 3 rounds, but in this boxing match, it could go as long as 10 rounds, which you would have to think would favor Nate Diaz. Remember the whole talk about Jorge Masvidal gassing out before, right? Nate was saying that Jorge was slowing down. He was going to start beating him in the 4th and 5th rounds. Now we're going to be able to see if Jorge can keep up that pace with Nate, where the distance is going to be shorter because of the lack of kicks. And you guys can catch this fight live on pay-per-view at DAZN by clicking the link in the description below. The fight is going to be on July 6th, tomorrow at 9 p.m. Catch this fight live between these two legends. And I was just watching some Fedor highlights. That guy had different kind of aura. I wish I was old enough to watch him in his prime live. I wish I watched the Crow Cop fight. It's like looking back at the Crow Cop fight specifically, it's known to be one of the biggest heavyweight fights of all time. I don't know the viewership of it. I don't know how many people actually watched it, but that was the buildup of the fight. The defining moment, the most prestigious matchup in MMA history up to that date, and even a little bit further after that too. Fedor versus Crow Cop was one of the few times in MMA history where the two very best heavyweights went up against each other. It would be like something similar to Jon Jones versus Francis Ngannou. Maybe something similar to Stipe versus Cain Velasquez in their primes if that ever was able to happen. That's what Fedor versus Crow Cop essentially was like. And people got to watch that live. And it's funny, in every highlight reel you see of Fedor, you always see him getting hurt, like Fujita rocking him, nearly knocking him out with that one right hook. Kevin Randleman slamming him on his head. Rarely do you ever see someone's highlights include moments where they had to bounce back from nearly losing to get the win. It was such a different time back then for MMA. Not that it was better or worse, but it was just such a different atmosphere. I think the overall best era of MMA was like 5 years ago or so, maybe like 5 to 4 years ago. The golden era of Silva, GSP, Aldo, Jones, Kane, Frankie, Dominic Cruz, like that was a very good era as well. All dominant champions breaking records at the same time in each division. But then you also did have the early 2000s and the mid 2000s where both the UFC and Pride were putting on very good fights. The intensity of those matchups were something different, man. When you saw Vanderlei fight Chuck Liddell, Rampage, Fedor, Shogun. They weren't as technical or as skilled as they are today, but those guys were ferocious, man. A very entertaining era back then. And I would say Fedor is one of the few fighters, if you were to plug him into the heavyweight division today, he could do very well, right? There's a few guys like that. You know, him, Anderson Silva, George St. Pierre, prime Dominic Cruz, prime Jose Aldo, prime Chad Mendez, and there's a few others as well. But let's jump into some fight news. So, some things regarding the fighters of UFC 303. Dan Ige wants to welcome Ryan Garcia into MMA. That is something I did not expect, especially from Ige. And Ryan Garcia responded and say, yeah, fine, whatever, let's do it. I don't know if he can though, because the athletic commission suspended him for popping for Ostarine, I believe. And I don't know if that's just for boxing or is for all sports. Maybe they can have the fight over in Abu Dhabi or something like that. But that would be an excellent MMA debut for Garcia. He would lose. The only reason I say it's a good one is because Dan Ige is saying he's not going to shoot takedowns. And if he actually goes into the fight standing up with Ryan Garcia, that would be very interesting. One leg kick and Garcia's probably done, but Garcia wants to go right into the deep end, right? He's talking about fighting like Sean O'Malley and stuff like that. So get him in there with Dan Ige. The guy jumped in on a few hours notice to fight Diego Lopes, did very well. If Ryan Garcia wants to fight anybody, do him and Dan Ige. Brian Ortega spoke and he said that he's willing to fight Diego Lopes later in the year. That fight should get put together again. Give Diego Lopes that chance. For some young fighters, it's not the best thing to push him up to the top of the weight class right away like that, but Diego Lopes is not that young and he has a lot of MMA experience. In fact, he has more fights, more pro fights than Brian Ortega does. They're not at the highest level. They're not against champions and top contenders, but he's been fighting for a pretty long time. Diego Lopes has 31 professional fights, where Ortega only has 20. And Lopes is 29 years old, so he should be in the prime of his career right now. Another fighter that was talking and he was making absolutely no sense, is Ian Machado Garry. I think he's playing into the villain role. There's no way he believes the stuff he says. So he says that he will one time be the greatest fighter in history with the likes of Anderson Silva, Jon Jones, etc. He also says he's the best calf kicker with Alex Pereira in the sport. Before, he was talking about how his stand-up skills are next generational, yet this guy turned into a wrestler as soon as Michael Page threw one punch at him. I don't think he believes the stuff that he's saying about his skills, and he's just trying to bait everybody into disliking him, right? He's trying to play the villain. He's trying to get some kind of attention from the audience in that direction instead of trying to be the fan favorite. He wants fans to watch his fights, hoping that he will lose, because he's absolutely not one of the best calf kickers. This guy couldn't even finish Neil Magny with calf kicks, the guy who doesn't defend leg kicks at all. He's not a next generational striker. We were thinking that he may be, but then the way he fought Michael Page and even his striking performance against Neil Magny wasn't that impressive. He's clearly not the best striker in his weight class, not even top 3, I would say. I would say Leon, Jack Della Maddalena, Michael Page, Stephen Thompson, Shavkat Rakhmonov. These guys are better strikers than Ian Garry is. Now, I do wonder how much of the pressure from the fans, considering everything that happened before, may have gotten to his head in this fight with Michael Page, because he fought so differently. It may be strategy, you know, grapple with the guy and all that stuff, but when he was standing with Michael Page, he was not looking good at all. I don't think the pressure from the fans got to him in that fight as much as him just trying to find a way to beat this guy and not fight him on the feet. But if he can't handle that kind of pressure from the fans before, I don't know how he's going to handle the pressure trying to play the villain. Because if he keeps winning and keeps talking the way he's talking, he's going to become the most hated fighter in the welterweight division, if he isn't already. It's like a contest between him and like Belal Muhammad. And honestly, in the past, the only thing that saved Ian Garry from not being hated more than Belal Muhammad was him actually getting knockouts and having some exciting performances. But if he keeps fighting the way he fought Michael Page, or just makes it boring, a point fighting contest, taking the fighter to the ground and holding him, like, he's gonna become a lot more hated than Belal Muhammad is. And he says he's gonna fight for the welterweight title in 2025, and says that he would love to fight Shavkat Rakhmonov around that time, hoping that he would be the guy who takes the undefeated record from Shavkat. I don't think he beat Shavkat though. Where does he beat him? I don't think he could stand up with him that well. The only thing about Shavkat is that he doesn't move his head, but he can't grapple Shavkat at all. He's weaker than him physically. He might be a little bit faster. I think Shavkat Rakhmonov beats Ian Garry in every part of the fight except like mid-range boxing or mid-punching range. When you guys hear about Diego Lopes, he apparently didn't even need to fight to get paid. They were willing to just pay him without fighting, and he said, no, I'm gonna fight. I'll fight anyone, anywhere, anytime. I'm 161 pounds, throwing anybody into the cage, and I'm fighting that guy. What a warrior this guy is, man. And that was a very risky move for him, to cut weight like that and still be willing to stay in the fight against anybody they picked. And he didn't even need to do that. Yeah, definitely give that guy Brian Ortega next. Oh, and did you guys notice during the card that Daniel Cormier did not know who Peyton Talbot was? Now, I don't expect every person to know every fighter, right? Not every fan needs to know every single fighter on the roster. But Daniel Cormier commentated Talbot's last fight before against Cameron Simon. How did he not know who Peyton Talbot was? Even though he should be doing his homework for commentating this card. He should know who Talbot is at least, right? There's a lot of hype on him. A lot of people are talking about him. Joe Rogan knew who he was. Right, Joe Rogan didn't commentate his last fight. Maybe Dominic Cruz was right that Daniel Cormier does not research before commentating fights. Now, I do agree with him that most fighters, when they're that big of favorites, it doesn't really make sense. But for Peyton Talbot, the way that he performed, knocked that guy out really quickly, yeah, it made a lot of sense for Peyton Talbot to be that big of a favorite. Another thing regarding Robert Whittaker's fight with Ikram Aliskerov the week before, interesting enough, he said when he knocked out Ikram with that uppercut, a flash of the clip from Khamzat landing the uppercut played into his head. He said this verbatim, quote, I kid you not, in the fight I had a flash of seeing that clip from Chimaev. I remember watching it and maybe it played into it a bit, unquote. He's talking about the uppercut. That's crazy, man. Now, Ikram was hurt regardless, so I do think he could have connected with any other kind of punch, but the uppercut was perfect, right? Especially with the opening that Ikram gave him on his guard. The guard was wider at the bottom, more of an opening for an uppercut to land, and Sean Strickland said that he's not going to fight Robert Whittaker. He said that Whittaker lost to both Izzy and Dricus, whereas he arguably beat both of them. He just beat Paulo Costa, so he believes that he's next in line for a title shot, which I could kind of agree with. You know, I do think if Strickland does not want to fight Whittaker, he shouldn't have to in order to get his title shot. So I like to see Whittaker fight Imavov or someone like that, #1 contender fight, and then in the meantime, Strickland fights the winner of Dricus and Adesanya. I know some people are saying that, why would he have to fight Imavov? Who's Imavov? Well, Imavov is a top 5 fighter who just beat Jared Cannonier. Although it was an early stoppage, he did ultimately win that fight. And it's one of the few guys in the top 5 that Whittaker has never fought before. I think the only other top 5 fighter he hasn't fought is Strickland. Whittaker also lost to Izzy and Dricus, right? That point is correct. He lost to Dricus not that long ago. Now, in the rematch with Izzy, I do think he won that fight, but Dricus is the champ right now. And we all know if Adesanya wins, he's going to call out Strickland. He's going to pick Strickland over Whittaker any day. 100%. He would want to prove that fight was a complete fluke. And isn't it crazy? All these fighters are having a hard time with Sean Strickland. They just can't beat him decisively, right? He gives them at least a tough fight. And the only fighter that completely wiped him out in the middleweight division was Alex Pereira. Isn't that crazy? Adesanya lost to him. Dricus nearly lost to him, and a lot of people believe that Strickland won the fight. Cannonier almost lost to him. He just beat Paulo Costa, and Alex Pereira knocked this guy out in the first round. That's how good Alex Pereira is, man. All these guys are having a hard time with Sean Strickland, but not Pereira. When you have to think of a couple fighters that represent this era of MMA, like the 2020s, I would say it's Alex Pereira and Islam Makhachev. If you pick two faces to represent the 2020s of MMA, I think it's those two guys. We still have like half the decade to go left, but Pereira and Islam are definitely the faces of the sport right now. And they're both #1 and #2 pound-for-pound fighters at the moment. Alex Pereira has officially jumped over Jon Jones as the #2 pound-for-pound fighter, according to these journalists, right? These journalists are the ones that make the rankings, and we know Jon Jones is definitely not happy about him being #3 because he was arguing to be #1. He thought that he was better than Islam Makhachev. Now for him to be under Alex Pereira is kind of crazy. And even though Alex Pereira is probably my favorite fighter to watch right now for entertainment and stuff, and his striking style is so fun to watch, Jon Jones would wash him in a fight. Like, let's be honest here. In a pound-for-pound fight, Jon Jones is definitely better than Alex Pereira. But the pound-for-pound rankings have changed. They're not necessarily about who's the best skill-wise across weight classes. It's about achievements and what did you accomplish recently, who did you beat, all that sort of stuff, instead of the actual skills. Because if we go by actual skills, light heavyweights, heavyweights, and middleweights are not on that list. Except maybe Jones. Yeah, except maybe Jones, right? If we really go by the real definition of pound-for-pound, you're only going to see welterweights and down. That's all you're going to see in the top 15. You're going to see contenders on there over the heavier champions, right? You'll see Corey Sandhagen in the top 15 and not Dricus du Plessis, because the lighter weight classes, in my opinion, are way more skilled. Like, they're just better fighters overall. They have to kind of be because they're just smaller, right? So their skills will translate weight classes much better than the heavier guys who are not nearly as skilled. Most of them aren't, right? Jon Jones is like the only exception. He's one of the only heavier guys that's actually very good and well-rounded. He has high fight IQ, all that stuff. He doesn't really have a big weakness, like, for an example, Pereira with his grappling, or Cyril Gane with his grappling, or Johnny Walker and his defensive striking skills. Like, if you saw Johnny Walker in the lightweight division or the featherweight division, that guy would never even sniff the top 15. Never. He would never become a top 5 fighter or a top 10 fighter. But the definition of pound for pound has definitely changed over time. So it's about accomplishments. And if you go by accomplishments and what they've done recently in terms of like how often they've been fighting and stuff, then Alex Pereira is definitely top 3 right now. The guy's so insanely active. He's beating the best light heavyweights in the world, knocking them out, except Jan Blachowicz. That was a close fight. And it's funny because Jan Blachowicz is one of the only fighters that actually fought Pereira the right way, the way to beat him in a fight. Take this guy to the ground immediately when the round starts. But no, Jamal Hill wants to strike with him. Yuri Prochazka wants to strike with him. Ankalaev is now saying that he wants to strike with him. Like, if they do not mix up wrestling effectively, he's going to knock them out in the stand-up. I think at this point, Ankalaev has to be kind of trolling, right? There's no way he's actually going to stand with Alex Pereira, right? There's no way he's going to go back and forth with him punching with that guy. He will get knocked out into the next dimension if he does not wrestle. Alex Pereira will take those legs home with him with how many calf kicks he'll land. I mean, Jan Blachowicz was destroying Ankalaev's legs with leg kicks. And we saw the leg kicking battle happen between Pereira and Blachowicz, right? Pereira was winning that entire battle against him. So Ankalaev has to absolutely wrestle with Pereira if he wants to win that. And even with it, it's like I mentioned before, Ankalaev is not like that dangerous of a grappler. He will set up rear naked chokes like he did against Jan, but he's not a big submission threat or even that big of a ground and pound artist comparable to like Khabib or something, you know? He's not a grappler like Islam Makhachev, and he's not a ground and pound artist like Khabib. He's good for the light heavyweight division, right? He's probably the best wrestler in that weight class, or at least in the top 15. But Alex Pereira can absolutely win that fight, even if Ankalaev wrestles with him. Pereira has shown to have very good cardio, even if he is getting wrestled, right? He showed that against Jan. Outlasted that guy, had better cardio than him. This guy's gone 5 rounds so many times already, whether it's in kickboxing or MMA. That cardio has translated to when he wrestles as well, which is very interesting. Even at 205 pounds, his last 2 fights in kickboxing were in the light heavyweight division against Artem Vakitov, who is one of the best kickboxers in the world. 5 rounds with that guy twice in a row. But there seems to be a bit of a misconception with Alex Pereira when you compare him to his middleweight self and his light heavyweight self. So there's some people talking about how he got knocked out by Israel Adesanya, and they're kind of glazing that accomplishment. Now, that's an insane feat, an amazing accomplishment, whether beating him at middleweight or light heavyweight. If you beat Alex Pereira, that's huge for anybody's career. But people are making it seem like Adesanya beat the best version of Alex Pereira, which is not true. The best version of Alex Pereira is in the light heavyweight division. It's just clear at this point. It's very obvious. He was not the same fighter at 185 pounds. Now, when I say that, I'm not trying to make it like it's a drastic difference. He's still Alex Pereira at the end of the day, a very good fighter. But physically speaking, when you look at his chin and you even look at his power, he's not as dangerous at middleweight. As Pereira has gotten older and bigger, he's been a better fighter at 205. He has more power there. He takes a better punch. I mean, Yuri has an iron chin who walks through some of the biggest punchers at 205 pounds. But he can't take a single left hook from Pereira without being wobbled or getting stunned. Pereira couldn't KO Bruno Silva at middleweight. That guy hit him with so many big shots throughout that fight, and Bruno Silva never went away. All those punches and knees, and even Adesanya took a bunch of shots in both of their fights, while these guys are smaller than Yuri Prochazka, right? Yuri is known for an amazing chin. This guy was walking through Rakic's punches, clean punches on the face, on the jaw, on the temple, everywhere, like they were nothing. And Rakic is like walking around at nearly 240 pounds. That guy is massive, very fast, very dangerous striker when he's actually throwing at you, and he was trying to light up Yuri Prochazka, but every time he hit it, that wick was not lighting up. Yet Pereira floored him while moving backwards with a left hook, right? Pereira's chin was so bad at 185 pounds that people thought he was chinny. People thought he had a bad chin because he would get hurt so easily at middleweight. But after seeing him go up to the light heavyweight division and take shots from both Yuri and Jan Blachowicz, it shows that Pereira's chin was definitely weakened by the weight cut to make 185 pounds. Bro walks around at 230 pounds, which is proven at this point. That guy walks around 230 pounds. He was fighting at 185 pounds. Of course his chin would be weakened at that point. When you're cutting that much weight, there's no way you could be the same fighter. Do you know what Izzy's fight with Pereira was kind of like? It was like Pereira was a boss in Elden Ring, right? He has 2 phases. Izzy beat the first phase, which is the 185 pound version of himself. The second phase is Pereira gets a little bit bigger, he gets a little thicker, he gets a better chin, he gets more powerful with every punch. The 205-pound version of Alex Pereira is the second phase that Izzy has to beat. And if Izzy does get past Dricus, I would love to see these two fight again at light heavyweight. And I think Izzy would do it, right? I mean, it gives him another chance to get the second belt. Wait, what's this I'm reading about Kelvin Gastelum? Oh, we got some excuses. Okay, Kelvin Gastelum's excuses for not making weight. So his coach said this: number 1 out of 5. Kelvin did not know of the fight until the UFC announced it. He woke up to IG and it was on. That's according to his coach. The second excuse, Kelvin was in a motorcycle accident in Thailand, which gave him staph infection. Number 3, before Kelvin left to go to Saudi Arabia 2 weeks before the fight, he got another staph infection. Number 4, the meals were different from the usual meals he would have during weight cuts, resulting in Kelvin being heavier. Just tell Kelvin to put down the tacos. Bro's not fooling anyone with that new meal preparation. And then finally, he says that Kelvin asked for a catch weight at 175 pounds, but the fight ultimately happened at 185. So he didn't know the fight was happening. He was in a motorcycle accident. He got staph infection twice, and he was eating tacos. I don't know how any of these are excuses when Diego Lopes cut to 146 pounds a couple weeks before the fight, or knowing that the fight was happening a couple weeks before. If he can cut weight in that short amount of time, there's no excuses for Kelvin Gastelum to not lose weight, or cut weight at the very least, when he knew the fight was happening longer than Diego Lopes knew his fight was happening with Ortega. The guy just keeps missing weight at 170 pounds. Oh, and apparently about Charles Oliveira, we got some fight news. The GOAT is back, and it's against everybody. Charles Oliveira is to fight everybody. So there's rumors of him fighting Alexander Volkanovski. Well, Volk was the one that said that he would love to fight Oliveira, because he said other than the title fight, there's nothing else at featherweight that excites him, so he would love to fight Oliveira next. That's next, too. He said his next fight before fighting Ilia Topuria, he would be down to fight Oliveira. But then again, Volk would be down to fight anybody. Charles Oliveira versus Dan Hooker is another fight that's rumored, and that was from Dan Hooker himself. Oliveira can finally get revenge on Dan Hooker for calling him Charlie Olives. Another rumor, Charles Oliveira versus Mateusz Gamrot for the Calgary, Alberta, Canada card on a fight night. And then another piece of rumored news, Charles Oliveira versus Benoit Saint Denis is very close to being finalized for the UFC Paris card. That's according to RMC Sports. So like, some of these are actually credible sources, and some of them aren't, and I don't know who Charles Oliveira is going to fight. I don't know if it's against Volk or Hooker or Benoit Saint Denis or Mateusz Gamrot. This is why we gotta wait until official news comes out and not just rumors, because there's a lot of rumors, a lot of baiting going on, but I would love to see Charles fight any of these guys. Charles versus Volk is definitely the best fight among them, but I'm pretty sure they want Volk to fight Topuria or Max Holloway, whoever has the featherweight title at the time. The one that makes the most sense is probably him versus Gamrot. They're both top 5 lightweights. The winner's 1 win away from a title shot after. And I would say from these 4 fights, Oliveira would beat Volkanovski. I don't think Volk has the chin to take a big shot from Oliveira, especially after getting knocked out twice like that. Oliveira arguably hits harder than Topuria too. I think Charles Oliveira destroys Dan Hooker. I think Oliveira beats Gamrot and destroys Benoit Saint Denis. Can I give one of my opinions here? This is like a bit of a hot take maybe. I don't view Benoit Saint Denis that highly. If I'm going to be completely honest, I think he's one of the most overhyped or overrated fighters in the lightweight division. I never really thought that much about Benoit Saint Denis, to be honest. I always thought he was just very physical, a very big guy. He's strong, you know, he's ferocious, he puts a lot of pressure. He's a pretty good grappler, but technically speaking, especially in the stand-up, he is lacking a lot of striking skill, especially defensively, even offensively. Like, he's, again, very physical. Like, that's the main thing about him. I can be wrong here, but I think Benoit Saint Denis' ceiling may be in the better part of the top 10, outside of the top 5. So like anywhere from number 10 to number 6 is kind of where I see Benoit Saint Denis' peak, unless he gets much better, like worlds better than where he is right now. If he keeps fighting the way he is, I don't think he's a top 5 guy. That's a big reason why I even picked Dustin Poirier to finish this guy. I just never thought that Benoit was that skilled in the stand-up. And Dustin Poirier gave him a lot of opportunities to finish him, or at least get a good position against him with all those pulled guillotines. There's a reason why Dustin didn't pull all those guillotines on Islam Makhachev. Can you imagine how short that fight would have been if Dustin actually tried to guillotine Islam? Like how he was pulling the guillotine on Benoit Saint Denis, and he still knocked Benoit out. Now, there's the whole thing with the staph infection, but staph doesn't make you fight like that. Staph doesn't destroy your stand-up skills, right? That technique is going to be there, especially in the first round, and Benoit did not show really any great technique on the feet, even in the first round. He was overwhelming Dustin, being as physical as possible, while also imposing wrestling threats, and that's just not going to work against some of the other fighters. Now, I don't think Benoit's a bad fighter. You know, a top 10 fighter in the lightweight division is still very good. But there's been a lot of hyping on him as if like he's a champion caliber fighter or top 5, top 3. This guy can give Islam problems. This guy could beat Justin Gaethje and Dustin Poirier and all these guys. He could probably beat Justin if Justin is on the decline from the Max Holloway fight. If Justin Gaethje is not the same after getting knocked out by Max Holloway like that, then I could see Benoit Saint Denis beating him. But any of those top guys at their best, I don't see Benoit beating him. And with that, let's go right to the questions. We're going to start with Troy Hartung. Knowing what happened now in the fight between Whittaker and Ikram, do you wish someone else had taken Khamzat's spot instead of Ikram, such as Usman, Bo Nickel, Imavov, or someone else? I know this question is more hindsight, but to me, it seemed like most people liked Ikram's chances way more than they should have based on how close the betting line was to a pick'em. And who do you think would have been the most challenging replacement that could have realistically stepped in? I would have loved to have seen Usman or Imavov step in, but realistically, I don't think they would have. Ikram stepped in, and it seemed to have been the most logical fighter on such a short amount of time that could have realistically have stepped in, right? I don't know if Bo Nickel would have fought. I mean, he said that he was on a mountain hiking or doing something. So Ikram stepping in there did make kind of sense for how short notice it was. And the most challenging replacement that could have realistically have stepped in, because Bo Nickel couldn't fight, I don't know if there was a more challenging opponent for Whittaker. Like, who else could have stepped in? Shirkali, the guy that Nurmagomedov fought? Maybe Nurmagomedov would have been a more dangerous opponent, or would have lasted longer than Ikram did. Well, I'm actually pretty sure Nurmagomedov would have lasted longer than Ikram, right? He wouldn't have gotten knocked out that quickly. But I think that Whittaker would have won regardless. I don't think anybody who could have fought Whittaker on that short of notice would have beaten him that night. And I'm not going to lie, it's great to see him actually get a knockout after so long. And just as I said before the fight, it put him in position where he's like one win away. It didn't matter if he was going to beat Khamzat or Ikram, he was going to be in that position. And he got a very good, devastating win, destroying Ikram very quickly. But I don't think that's a good thing for Ikram's prospect getting knocked out like that, right? The guy's now known to be somewhat of a chinny fighter. But we have to also remember that he was cutting weight the week before. Then we go to Ad Hamala. Number one, if Jon Jones lost to Stipe, where does that put Stipe? He would, of course, be the heavyweight champ and easily the greatest heavyweight of all time above Fedor Emelianenko. If he beat Jon Jones while out of his prime, in his 40s, where everyone is counting him out, he'd also have to be top 10 or top 5, maybe, greatest fighters of all time across all weight classes. And then number two, what is Dustin next fight can be to back to fight? I don't know if you're asking what's Dustin's next fight. Well, I would say Dustin Poirier's next fight could be maybe against Colby Covington at welterweight, maybe against Conor McGregor or Michael Chandler. Again, I mean, maybe not Michael Chandler. It would have to be the winner of that fight. I think that's the fight that makes the most sense for Dustin next, is the winner of Conor and Chandler. Then we go to Muhammad Ali. Hi, Weasel. Massive fan. In my opinion, Rob deserves a title shot more or at least equal to Strickland. Strickland's claim to a title shot is a very close fight with DDP and beating Izzy and Costa. Rob beat Izzy clearer than Strickland beat DDP in my opinion. Rob also beat Costa before Strickland beat him, and I was extremely surprised when Strickland, the top contender, fought Costa in a very boring fight. Strickland should fight Whittaker, or if he refuses, Whittaker should get the title shot. Whittaker is more deserving and has proven more. This is baseless, but I'm saying it anyway. DDP gets slept badly in the rematch against Whittaker and gets slept even worse in the first round against Izzy. Interesting, okay. So I don't agree completely. It's not that big of a difference, honestly. Strickland and Whittaker are close to a title shot at least, but I would say that Strickland deserves it more than Whittaker for the fact that officially Whittaker lost to both DDP and Adesanya, right? He got TKO'd by Dricus. We cannot forget about that. And Strickland beat Adesanya very easily and almost beat the current champion. That's the biggest thing here. Whittaker, not that long ago, got destroyed by Dricus du Plessis. And that's the major reason as to why I believe that Strickland deserves that title shot over Robert Whittaker. Now, I'd prefer them two to fight each other over anything, right? I would love to see Whittaker fight Strickland. That fight makes the most sense, but if they're not going to fight each other and one of them has to fight for the title next, I think it should be Strickland. And also, the Strickland fight is bigger pay-per-view wise against either Adesanya or Dricus du Plessis. And we do know that both DDP and Izzy would pick to fight Strickland over picking to fight Robert Whittaker. And you say DDP gets slept badly in a rematch against Whittaker, which I could definitely see that. I think in a rematch, Whittaker has a much better chance of beating DDP, and it would prove right or wrong to the people that think that Whittaker just had an off night, depending how he performs against DDP. And you say that DDP loses even worse against Izzy, getting slept in the first round. If DDP strikes with Adesanya like that, swinging overhands and haymakers like when he fought Strickland, I can see Izzy knocking him out in the first round. But I don't think Dricus would do that. I don't think Dricus is that incompetent, that much on the spectrum to start throwing haymakers at Adesanya. Dricus' best path to win this is wrestling right away. Mix up the striking, of course. He doesn't want to be super one-dimensional and then get sniped by Adesanya. But that fight really comes down to how Dricus du Plessis game plans on fighting Adesanya. It's really going to come down to fight IQ for Dricus. Then we go to Mike Griffith. I asked you on your last podcast that if Conor McGregor were to get training from a legend like Canelo for at least a year, he would probably have a chance against Mayweather, given the fact that he's way older now. And you even said if Conor trains with Canelo and Muhammad Ali, he won't beat Mayweather. I'm sorry, but I have to push back against that. Yes, we know Conor McGregor has been partying and drinking, but I'm talking about in a fantasy world. Let's pretend Conor stops the partying and drinking and just puts his heart and soul into boxing and just trains with Canelo, Pacquiao, and those guys for like a year. You're telling me there's no way in the world he would win? A guy like Conor, who's only 36, training with the best boxers for like a year, is impossible for him to beat a guy who, yes, is the best, but is pushing almost 50 years old. Really, I don't want to sound rude, brother, but Mayweather is not a god. If a guy like Ngannou, who has way less boxing skills than Conor McGregor, could beat Tyson, then you would have to give Conor at least a small chance against Floyd. Who knows what would happen if Floyd makes a mistake and Conor catches him with a clean one. He's human at the end of the day, and Conor's timing is one of the best in the UFC. Well, see, that's the thing. It's one of the best in the UFC. Boxing in MMA is not the same as boxing in the sport of boxing, right? The timing is also a bit different with the way that boxers throw their punches and how they feint at you and all this sort of stuff. Now, I understand with the whole age thing, right? Floyd is 47 years old, but a 47-year-old Floyd Mayweather is not the same as other fighters who are at that age, right? You can even look at Bernard Hopkins, right? Bernard Hopkins won the IBF light heavyweight title at 48 years old against boxers. He defended it too, right? He defended a couple times, and the boxers that he beat were better than Conor McGregor in the sport of boxing, right? Beating guys like Bebu Shumanov and Karl Murat. If Bernard Hopkins can beat those guys, even older than Floyd Mayweather is right now, I think Floyd Mayweather can absolutely beat Conor McGregor, even if Conor has a year of boxing training with some of the best boxers in the world. Now, I don't think Floyd's unbeatable, right? Eventually, he'd get to an age where he cannot compete at all, even with Conor McGregor. But Conor's not that young, or young enough to where Floyd has to worry about that. You know what I'm saying? They're about 10 years apart. When Floyd is 57 years old and Conor's 46, Floyd is still going to probably beat Conor McGregor. When Floyd's 67 and Conor's 56, Floyd is still probably beating Conor in boxing. I think he'll always be able to beat Conor in the sport of boxing forever, especially as one of the few boxers in history that has aged very well. I mean, he's one of the few guys that hasn't really taken that much brain damage. Again, he's not a big partier. He doesn't drink. He doesn't have like these kind of vices. He still works out. He's still very involved in training his other fighters. When you see these other boxers make their returns at an older age and beat actual good champions and top contenders, you have to also view Floyd Mayweather in a similar kind of conversation, right? He's one of the guys that has aged like Bernard Hopkins and George Foreman and some of these other boxers. And to think one of the best boxers of all time like that will lose to Conor McGregor is just something I don't agree with. You know, I can't agree that Conor would ever beat Floyd Mayweather unless Floyd has stopped training completely and Conor trained for like another 5 to 7 years, solely focusing on beating Floyd Mayweather, not just training boxing, but only focusing on beating Floyd specifically, game planning against him, drilling techniques against him specifically. Then I could probably see Conor beating Floyd one day. And we have to also remember that the best boxers in the world are not always the best coaches. So if you train with some of these top tier boxers, it doesn't necessarily mean that he has received the best training. Then we go to the worst box. What are the biggest fraud checks you see coming in each division? The heavyweight division, well, it kind of already happened with Rebellas Despain and a little bit with Sergey Pavlovich and even a little bit with Jailton Almeida. Heavyweights had a lot of fraud checks lately. Now, I won't say Pavlovich is a fraud check actually because he lost to another top tier heavyweight, but Rebellas Despain and Jailton Almeida, those are kind of fraud checks in a way, considering that people thought that Almeida would become a top contender in the heavyweight division and got absolutely destroyed by Curtis Blades, whereas Sergey Pavlovich proved that he belongs in the top 5. You know, losing to Volkov, who was a pretty dominant loss, but we cannot forget that Sergey destroyed Curtis Blades, who's fighting for the title. Jailton Almeida and Rebellas Despain don't have any wins like that. But the next fraud check, or one of the biggest fraud checks, I don't think there's another one. Like, what other heavyweight is hyped up right now? Yeah, I don't think heavyweight really has any situation for a fraud check. For the light heavyweight division, I guess it was Johnny Walker, but who else is hyped up right now? Carlos Ulberg could be the next fraud check, but I think the guy's good. So it's going to depend on his matchup. If he gets matched up the wrong way and he loses, then everybody's going to say it's a fraud check. But there are specific styles here that he could beat. Right? Carlos Ulberg could beat Jamal Hill. He could. But he probably loses to like Yuri Prochazka, where Yuri eats all of his punches and then bullies him. Kind of how Kennedy Nzechukwu did, right? If Kennedy can eat all your punches like that and then finish you, I'm pretty sure Yuri could do the same. If Yuri's chin is not cracked. For the middleweight division, I'm going to say Caio Borralho. I think Caio Borralho might be the next fraud check, but they're probably not going to throw him up the rankings like that, so he's probably going to get a couple good wins. I know a lot of people say Bo Nickel or Khamzat, which would be the biggest fraud check if either of them lose, just because they're the most hyped up, but I think both of those guys will potentially be better than Caio Borralho. For the welterweight division, Ian Garry. For the lightweight division, just because he has some more hype, maybe Benoit St. Denis. Still, for the featherweight division, if Movsar Evloev loses to a top 5 fighter, is that technically be a fraud check? If not Movsar Evloev, I'd probably say the only other guy that could get fraud checked is Diego Lopes. Then the bantamweight division, the 2 fighters that could get fraud checked are Umar, because he is fighting Corey Sandhagen, and potentially Peyton Talbot. Every other fighter seems pretty concrete on where they stand. And I think both Umar and Talbot are going to do pretty well, so I don't really see a fraud check, but it could be Umar, right? If he loses to Corey, people are going to say that's a fraud check, even though on paper, Corey should win the fight, looking at his experience and all that stuff. In the flyweight division, Muhammad Mokaev. They're with the Angela Kala. Why is Dana so insistent on making Jones versus Stipe for the belt when the fans don't care about that fight? Dana helped make the UFC great by putting on fights that matter because he hated the boxing business where promoters weren't putting on the important fights. Now all of a sudden, Dana is doing what he claims he hated about boxing. I think it's to build up Jones, right? If Jones beats Stipe, which everybody favors him to do so, Jones becomes like that one fighter, the all-time great fighter of the sport in all of history, right? And you do see Dana promoting him as such, right? Dana's saying that Jon Jones is the greatest of all time, and anybody who disagrees, they're wrong in that debate. Jon Jones is the pound-for-pound #1. Jon Jones is the best fighter in the world. He's the greatest fighter of all time with accomplishments. And I think he's doing that to build up the fight, which makes sense, right? Business-wise. It makes sense for him to build up Jon Jones as such because that's what that fight is all about, right? Jon Jones will become like the Muhammad Ali of MMA or the Tiger Woods of MMA, right? We don't really have that guy yet. And I think Jon Jones is the one that could be looked as such, especially if he beats Stipe. The casual fans will absolutely love that, right? The casual fans want to see Jon Jones as that kind of guy. And if they build up this fight that way, where Stipe is the greatest heavyweight of all time and Jones beats him, then Jon Jones would be looked as the greatest fighter of all time, the baddest man on the planet, even though realistically, he should be fighting Tom Aspinall. He should be fighting Tom Aspinall. Jones is even avoiding that guy, right? Jones is saying that he'd fight Alex Pereira before fighting Tom Aspinall if Pereira can beat Aspinall first. Jon Jones is avoiding Tom Aspinall like the plague. I've never seen a champion avoid the top challenger like that before. I've never seen it. It's crazy. When has ever the champion avoided the interim champion like that? It's never happened. Or even the top contender of the weight class. So it's a bit of a thing between the casual fans and the hardcore fans, because the hardcore fans want to see Aspinall fight Jon Jones because it's the fight that needs to happen. It's the fight that makes sense. They both hold the belt. The hardcore fans view Tom Aspinall as the real heavyweight champ. The casual fans view Jon Jones as the real heavyweight champ. They probably don't even know who Tom Aspinall is, to be honest. Tom Aspinall is Jon Jones' hardest matchup in the heavyweight division. And I think Jones even knows that. And that may be one of the reasons why he doesn't even want to fight Aspinall. I mean, look at the way he's talking about beating all these guys. He just talked about beating Alex Pereira like he beats Cyril Gane. He knows he can beat these guys that way. He would destroy Alex Pereira, just how he destroyed Cyril Gane, and he's probably going to destroy Stipe in a similar way too. But the only guy he can't beat like that is Tom Aspinall, and he knows that. Jones is not stupid. Jones is very smart. He studies all of these fighters. He knows all of their strengths and weaknesses, and when he sees Tom Aspinall, he knows that's the hardest matchup. And he also knows Aspinall's not that big of a star. That's why he's asking Alex Pereira to beat Aspinall for him. So when you say that the fans don't care about the fight between Jones and Stipe, that's not actually true. A lot of people want to see that fight, right? A lot of people are going to watch that fight, 100%. They're with the WXFR. Oiled up face reveal? Yes, when I do the face reveal, I'm going to be all oiled up for you, man. I'm going to be absolutely glazing myself. Wait, who said they're edging to this right now? Bro, should I put that on OF? No, I'm just kidding. They're with the Yas and Turkmen. Should the Prime Minister of Brazil have Johnny Walker's number on speed dial to warn him for the next gust of wind that knocks him out? The Prime Minister calls in, "Hey Johnny, there's a gust of wind coming in. You should stay inside. I don't know if your brain can handle this 10-mile-per-hour wind." But Johnny Walker was going out for a run that day. People driving on the road, they see Walker on the sidewalk doing the Looney Tunes wobble. "Dad, who's that on the sidewalk?" "Son, that's just Johnny Walker. Seems to have been caught in the wind." The wind just rocking Johnny Walker. He's flopping around on the sidewalk. No, I'm just kidding. But Johnny Walker should definitely take some time off to heal his brain. And we've been saying it for years, but he's got to work on his defense. You know, he's got to work on that boxing defense specifically. The man's so physically gifted. He's such an athletic freak. Tall, long, strong, powerful, fast, athletic. But he just has no defensive skills at all. And no chin to go with that. They're going to joist. Do you think fans truly appreciate what Alex Pereira has done for the UFC and fight fans in general this calendar year alone? For saving cards to always giving 110% every fight. This phrase often gets overused, but in 2024, he is truly one of a kind in combat sports. He truly is. An overused phrase, but definitely true for Alex Pereira. A champion being active and putting on those kind of performances is something that the sport really doesn't see that often. And I do think that fans are really appreciating him because he's growing bigger as a star. I mean, he is arguably the second or third biggest star in the UFC right now. At least that's what it seems like after Conor McGregor and Jon Jones, right? Conor's #1, Jon Jones is #2, and then Pereira's probably #3 biggest stars. I mean, the man just stepped in at UFC 303 after being injured a couple months after knocking out Jamal Hill. And he goes and puts on a performance like that against Jiří Prochazka. And the man says he wants a 5-month break before fighting again. 5-month break. A break for most champions is like a year. And Pereira is arguably the greatest combat sports athlete of all time, right? With what he did in kickboxing and now what he's doing in MMA, it's just absolutely insane. I've said it before, he is probably the greatest signing the UFC has ever made from another sport. Or, you know, he wasn't necessarily from another sport. He was competing in MMA before the UFC, but like, you know, he came from another sport. He's probably the best signing ever for the UFC. He's an amazing star, big knockout artist, puts on good performances, willing to fight anyone, anytime, anywhere. A good personality, the fans love him. A good guy, it seems, has a very inspirational background. They could do a movie on this guy one day, just like Francis Ngannou and some other fighters as well. They can absolutely do a movie or some kind of documentary on Alex Pereira. Then we go to the next question. What is TRT Pereira capable of? Bro would fight Thanos. TRT Pereira would exit this reality and he'd start showing up in the Dragon Ball Super episodes. TRT Pereira would be the front line of our Space Force. Bro would have to do handicap matches in MMA, not just one-on-ones. This guy says he would knock out a gorilla. He would decapitate a grizzly bear, Rogan to get bricked up at the sight of it. He beats Francis and Jones on the same night. He'd literally be an unstoppable fighter if you start pumping extra testosterone into that man. Bro, TRT Pereira and TRT Vitor would be some kind of like anime fight. Some like superhero stuff. Then we go to Clarity is Good. Service Weasel. I hope you doing all right. I'm already a big fan of Usman Nurmagomedov. What he has done in Bellator FC is just elite. I think he's the best lightweight in the world after Islam, and in terms of pure skill, he is even better. But only the Dagestanis know. How do you rate him and other world-class fighters outside the UFC like Patchy Mix, Vadim Nemkov, AJ McKee, Anatoly Malikin, and Patricio Pitbull? Do you think they are good enough for the UFC championship belt or top 5 ranking? Greetings from Germany. I love your content. Thank you so much, man. And you're a really big fan of the Bellator fighters, huh? Some of those guys are really good. Usman Nurmagomedov is definitely one of the best from Bellator. I also think Patchy Mix is a very good bantamweight. If he came into the UFC, he could do very good things over there. I mean, him and Usman would be an excellent addition to those weight classes, and I do think both of them might be able to come top 5 fighters. 155 for Usman, 135 for Patchy Mix. Vadim Nemkov could probably be like top 7, top 10. Actually, the weight class is just not that deep, so maybe he could even be top 5. AJ McKee would be a good addition as well. I think he would be a top 10 fighter, and Anatoly could also be a top 5 light heavyweight, maybe even a top 5 heavyweight. Again, those weight classes are just not that deep with talent, and his wrestling style will be very difficult for most of those fighters. Pitbull, though, he's a bit older. He is kind of small for the 155 and even the 145 pound weight classes, and he seems to be out of his prime now. But I will have to disagree about Usman Nurmagomedov being better than Islam. I think he's great. He's young. He still has more growing room. He's not even in his prime yet, which is crazy, but I definitely do not think he's better than Islam. We would have to see him in the UFC before we know how good Usman is. But off of what I see, I would probably say in the lower end of the top 5 or the upper end of the top 10, from number 10 to number 6. All right, so he'll probably be like anywhere from the number 7 fighter in the lightweight division to like the number 4 fighter. Anywhere in there, that's kind of how I see Usman Nurmagomedov right now until he gets better. And then we go to Egg Money. Why is there so many people quick to compare everyone's resume to Khabib? Is it hate towards Khabib? Is it fans somewhat angry at the fact that he retired without a loss? Or is it because he retired in the middle of his prime? A mixture of all the reasons, perhaps. Yeah, people compare other fighters' resumes to Khabib for many different reasons. Either they do hate him for whatever reason that is. You know, it could be many different things. Some do want to see him fight again, right? They don't like to see a fighter retire in the middle of their prime, especially when they didn't completely clean out their division. Whatever the reason is, I definitely do see a lot of people comparing fighters to Khabib, right? He's more compared to than anybody else. He's like the Goku of MMA or the Superman of MMA in that sense. When everybody's comparing even like who can beat Superman kind of thing, it's like who can beat Khabib or who's better than Khabib. You don't see a lot of other fighters getting compared to like how every fighter is compared to Khabib. Jon Jones is like another guy who's compared to a lot. When Max beat Justin Gaethje, people were saying, oh, now Max is greater than Khabib overall. Kamaru Usman is greater than Khabib. Leon Edwards is greater than Khabib. Fighters in almost every weight class, when they do something spectacular in their careers, they get compared to Khabib right away. It's like the first comparison you ever really see. Some of them may be correct, some of them may be incorrect, but I do find it fascinating how Khabib is like the standard for greatness, or at least that's what people made it seem like with all these comparisons to him. But another reason for the Khabib comparisons might be for the fact that for so much of his career, he didn't really fight top level talent. It was toward the end of his career before he retired where he finally faced the best in the world, right? He fought Conor McGregor, he fought Justin Gaethje, Dustin Poirier, he fought prime RDA. Barboza was a good win, Michael Johnson in his prime was a good win, but there was many more, right? There was Charles Oliveira coming up. The Tony Ferguson fight never happened, and he did try to make it happen for most of those. Tony Ferguson definitely tried to make that fight happen. He never had that super fight in the welterweight division or a featherweight coming up to his weight class like Volkanovski did when he fought Islam Makhachev, for an example. And maybe because because Khabib didn't fight guys like Oliveira and continue his career for super fights and other stuff that fans wanted to see from him, some people probably think that Khabib is greatly overrated in an all-time great list. And I think that might be the biggest reason as to why people compare other fighters to Khabib. It's like they're trying to prove a point that, Khabib is not as great as people think he is. He didn't do enough, right? He didn't have like longevity and fight longer in his prime. But the matter of the fact is, Khabib is the greatest lightweight of all time still, in my opinion. I think he's just above Islam. If Islam gets another win, breaks the record for title defenses at lightweight, then he might be above Khabib. And at this point, Khabib is probably somewhere in the top 10 greatest fighters of all time. Whether you have him lower in the top 10 or higher up in the top 10, I think he has to be in the top 10 somewhere. Yeah, it's pretty funny. Like, you'll see a lot of people talk about how Alex Pereira is greater than Khabib. But you guys see the whole thing about Khabib where he left the country and his gym got investigated because apparently there was some fighter that he has connections to, or a fighter that trained at his gym, and that guy's in trouble and stuff. I didn't look too deeply into it, but I did see some headlines that were quite alarming if they are true. And the final question we go to Kenzo Tenma. I just rewatched the Dustin and Islam fight again without commentary, so I wasn't influenced by the crowd or the commentary. I was shocked the amount of times Islam hit Dustin clean and tagged him. I've never seen Dustin get boxed up. I then rewatched the first Volk fight with Islam, muting the sound, and the same for the Charles fight, and I saw the same thing. I saw Islam tag Volk multiple times. Islam's timing and accuracy is ridiculous. Is this because he is so vastly experienced in combat sambo and has had hundreds of fights, therefore he had a head start over everyone else, thus giving him good sharp eyes to help his striking? Yeah, at this point, Islam's striking is not being underestimated like before. Everybody knows at this point that Islam Makhachev is a very skilled striker for MMA, and he blends it very well with his wrestling. To be able to compete with Dustin Poirier in his area of expertise, which is the boxing, was very impressive because Dustin is regarded as one of the greatest boxers in MMA history, right? He has some of the best boxing skills we've ever seen in the sport, and Dustin was able to hang with him in there, taking some of his biggest punches like that big left hand, I think it was in the 5th round, and he hit Dustin with some clean shots as well, striking very well and rocking even Alexander Volkanovski in his prime, and Volk is regarded as one of the best kickboxers in this sport. Now, can that be credited to his combat sambo skills or combat sambo experience? Yeah, it probably could be, right? He was doing that for a very long time. Before that, he was learning sambo, wrestling. He's been in combat sports for a very, very long time. And the description I give him and Khabib about having very good eyes might be from their combat sambo experience. And that's why sometimes you'll see Khabib or Islam, especially Khabib, get a bit sloppy with his striking technique and still get away with it without getting countered that hard or getting hit clean, because he sees the opponent's movements very clearly. And that's why he has this dippy, dodgy head movement that looks extremely awkward and still able to get away from some of the most precise punchers and some of the best strikers we've ever seen in the sport. They had a hard time landing clean shots on this guy, right? Not able to do it repeatedly or consecutively in their fights like that. It comes down to how well those fighters are able to see their opponent's movements, their punches, their kicks, how they want to counter, the footwork that they have, if they want to feint a certain way. And Khabib was beating these guys with not really that clean of technique when it came to his stand-up. And then you look at Islam. Islam is able to do the same thing, but with actual clean technique now. He has polished his striking to a level where he's able to compete skill for skill, technique for technique with some of the best strikers in the sport. And that's why I do think Islam Makhachev is going to surpass Khabib very, very soon, and possibly go down as one of the greatest pound-for-pound fighters we've ever seen in the sport. Maybe the best pound-for-pound fighter we've ever seen. I mean, this guy could literally do it all at an extremely high level. Extremely high level, man. His wrestling is top-notch. His submission skills are top-notch. His top position has always been elite. His striking is amazing to watch now. His footwork is excellent. He is trying to master the fundamentals of every single discipline that you need for MMA. In every era, you had that fighter who personified what a well-rounded fighter should look like, what an MMA fighter essentially should look like. Before we had Jon Jones, and before that we had GSP, and before that we had Fedor. In this era, we got Islam Makhachev. Actually, we'll do a couple more. Then we go to Farhan Akhtar. How many Yuri Prochazka and Alex Pereira would be needed to beat a Degen/Demon? And also, what if the UFC organized a fight between Alex and Yuri in an abandoned building? How many evil spirits would leave the building from their impregnable aura? By the way, love your content. Thank you so much, man. Of course, just one Yuri or Pereira would be needed to defeat defeat a Djinn/demon, especially Yuri, who has trained his body and spirit to combat evil spirits. And if they fought in an abandoned building, as soon as they stepped in, all the evil spirits would have to leave the building immediately. Once those punches start flying, they would get cleansed from the crossfire and shockwaves of their clash. Exposing times: could a 175-pound varsity high school boys wrestler who qualified for regionals or states beat Kayla Harrison in a wrestling match? Why or why not? Yeah, 100%. A varsity wrestler who's heavier than Kayla Harrison, she would get absolutely destroyed. He'd be way stronger than her, way better at wrestling than her, so he has the technique, he has the strength, he's most likely going to be more athletic. Yeah, that would be a mismatch. Then we go to Arhans. Number 1, Pereira vs. Israel at 205. Gotta go with Pereira. He could take a better punch, he's going to hit harder, Israel's going to be much lighter, and I don't think Pereira would make the same mistake of getting overly aggressive trying to finish him. He'd probably try to do it with one big shot instead of a huge combination. Pick his shots and be more of a sniper in that fight. Pereira vs. Ankalaev. I'm going to go with Pereira. I think he will land a lot of leg kicks, keep Ankalaev honest with a lot of body jabs and even jabs up to the head, and looking for Ankalaev to get wild with his hands before he counters him with a left hook or an uppercut or a right straight. But he also have to put a lot of pressure on Ankalaev with his footwork, making the wrestling a lot more obvious to defend. Pereira vs. Tom Aspinall. I'm going to go with Aspinall. I think he shoots a double leg immediately, takes Pereira to the ground and submits him. Jon Jones, kind of a similar thing. And then number 2, Chandler vs. Islam in November. Do you think Chandler has a chance if he fights with some game plan? Yeah, because stylistically and when you look at his attributes, he has the best chance of beating Islam on paper. If he fought smart, he has the best chance of defending Islam's takedowns. And with a good game plan on the feet, with how fast he is, he could catch Islam with some big punch. But to get Chandler to fight by some good game plan is probably the hardest task for Chandler's coaches. And then number 3, Peyton Talbot with Sean Strickland podcast. How do you see it going? Hey man, what's up with the pole dancing, man? You're a good fighter, but men don't need to be doing this, man. Painting your nails. Next thing you're gonna be touching your dog like a certain somebody. Then Peyton Talbot's gonna be like, you really have a problem with the way I pole dance and the way I dress? I don't know, man. It's just who I am. Or something like that. It would be a really interesting podcast episode. I would like to think that they would get along, but I have a feeling they probably wouldn't, especially when Peyton Talbot starts talking about like empty voids and stuff like that, unless Strickland would find that kind of interesting. And that's the end of the episode, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and if you did, make sure to subscribe. There's no UFC fights this weekend, but there is the boxing match between Nate Diaz and Jorge Masvidal. That's going to be kind of interesting. I do probably have Jorge winning that. I think he's aged better than Nate Diaz, especially when you saw Nate box with Jake Paul. I think that Jorge is probably going to beat him, and I'm thinking decision, not a knockout. But if he knocked Nate Diaz out, that would be kind of crazy. And AD has been going off with those press conferences. Didn't his goons chase after that one kick streamer, Neon or whatever his name is? Nate like doesn't want to show up to the press conferences. That's going to be an interesting one. So I'll see you guys in the next video.